Hi, Leo. So, this message is for the current energy around you. And the very first thing I'm picking up is that there's a major shift happening beneath the surface of a connection. Um, it feels like someone is starting to look back at everything from a completely different perspective than they did before. And what's interesting is that this person may have been very certain about their choices at one point. They genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They thought keeping their distance, staying silent, or putting their pride ahead of their feelings was the best way to protect themselves. At least, that's what they told themselves. But something is changing. Because the more they try to move forward, the more they realize there are emotions that were never fully resolved. There are memories that keep finding their way back. There are questions they can't brush aside as easily as they once did. Wow. It's almost like the things they tried hardest not to think about are becoming impossible to ignore. And Leo, the energy here suggests that someone is beginning to see the truth behind the decisions they made. Not just what happened, but why it happened. Not just what they chose, but what those choices may have cost them. So here's the question. What happens when someone finally realizes they may have lost something far more important than they ever imagined? Leo, I think the most painful part isn't the moment someone walks away. The most painful part is the moment they finally begin to understand why everything fell apart. Because sometimes a connection doesn't end because there wasn't enough love. Sometimes it ends because there were too many voices standing between two people. I feel like this is the story of someone who spent far too much time listening to everyone except their own heart. They listened to advice. They listened to fear. They listened to old beliefs. They listened to people who always seemed convinced they knew what was best. And over time, those voices became louder than the feelings they had been trying so hard to bury. What's interesting is that this person truly believed they were being rational. They thought they were in control. They thought they were strong enough to keep their distance, wise enough not to let emotions lead the way, careful enough not to place too much value on any one connection. But here's the thing. Sometimes what we call control is really just another form of avoidance. Because the harder they tried to prove they didn't need someone, the more energy they had to spend fighting what they actually felt. I keep feeling like certain conversations had a huge impact on them. Maybe it was friends. Maybe it was family. Maybe it was people who always seemed to have an opinion about their love life. And you know what's strange? When enough people keep repeating the same thing, we start questioning our own instincts. This person lived in that space for a long time. Every time their feelings for Leo became a little clearer, something would pull them back. A piece of advice, a fear, an old memory, a past experience that left a scar. Someone telling them they needed to be more careful, more realistic, more focused on themselves. And little by little, instead of asking what their heart wanted, they started asking what everyone else thought. Leo became the person carrying the weight of battles that Leo never created in the first place. Honestly, I don't feel like Leo was ever the problem here. I feel like Leo simply stood in front of someone who was still struggling with themselves. Someone who always wanted to appear strong. Someone who had a difficult time admitting when they were hurt. Someone who hated feeling vulnerable. And someone who rarely found it easy to say, I need you. So instead of facing their emotions, they met those emotions with defenses, with distance, with silence, with actions that sometimes made it seem like they didn't care. But the deeper I sit with this energy, the less I feel indifference. What I feel is fear. Fear of being hurt. Fear of trusting the wrong person. Fear of changing a life that had become familiar. And sometimes, fear of admitting that someone like Leo had touched parts of them they usually kept hidden from the world. Wow. It feels like this person spent so much time trying to win an argument, when what they really needed was honesty with themselves. Because somewhere deep down, there was a part of them that already knew. They knew they were pushing someone important away. They knew the distance was growing. They knew that every time they chose pride over sincerity, they were losing a little more of something that mattered. But back then, they believed there would always be more time. They believed everything would still be there later. They believed that if they wanted to fix it someday, they could. The thing is, lately I feel like something has started to shift. A very small realization, a very quiet one, but powerful enough to change the way they see everything. And because of that shift, they're beginning to look back at the choices they made with completely different eyes than before. A familiar room still looks exactly the same. The roads they've driven down countless times are still there. Their daily routines continue. Life on the outside hasn't really changed much at all. The only thing that's different is what they're carrying inside. Some losses arrive loudly. They shake everything. You can't miss them. But some losses show up so quietly that you don't even realize they're happening at first. I feel like this person once believed that creating distance would make everything easier. That if they didn't have to face their feelings, those feelings would eventually disappear on their own. That if someone walked out of their life, sooner or later they would simply get used to it. But that's not what happened, because what has been unsettling them isn't an external change, it's an internal one. There are these very ordinary moments, driving somewhere, eating a meal, hearing an old song, or simply sitting in a brief moment of silence in the middle of the day. And suddenly, they realize their mind has wandered back to the same place, the same person, the same feelings they tried so hard to ignore. This didn't happen overnight. It's more like a tiny crack appearing in a wall. At first, nobody notices it, but over time, that crack becomes more visible, harder to ignore, harder to pretend it's not there. I keep feeling like something happened between the two of you. A conversation, a misunderstanding, a moment where both people were carrying their own wounds, words spoken from emotion, reactions driven by self-protection, things that probably should have been said differently. And after everything, nobody really walked away feeling like they won. Wow, that's something I keep picking up very strongly in this energy. This person wanted to prove their point. They wanted to protect their pride. They wanted to show that they weren't the one in the wrong. But once the dust settled, what remained wasn't a feeling of victory. It was emptiness. Because there's a very simple truth here. Whether someone was right or wrong, the connection was no longer where it used to be. Leo wasn't standing in the place they had grown used to seeing them. Leo wasn't present in the way they once were. And that's when they began to understand the difference between winning an argument and losing someone important. I also feel like there was a period where this person tried to convince themselves that none of this affected them all that much. They kept living their life, kept working, kept making plans, kept showing up for meetings and commitments, kept moving forward as though nothing had happened. But emotions are difficult to negotiate with. You can postpone them. You can avoid them. You can stay busy. But real feelings have a way of finding their way back, especially when they involve someone who left a deep mark on your life. And honestly, I feel like this person started seeing Leo everywhere, not literally, but through unexpected memories. A familiar phrase, a song, a location, a scent, a small detail they never paid attention to before. And every time it happened, their heart sank just a little. Because the more they remembered, the more they realized how much they had taken for granted. How many things they assumed would always be there. How many things they believed could be fixed whenever they wanted, until the distance became real, until the silence lasted longer than expected, until they started wondering if maybe, just maybe, they had gone too far. I also feel like this is the stage where they're finally allowing themselves to sit with a sadness they've been hiding for a long time. There's less resistance now, less denial. Just a quiet awareness that something important is no longer where it once was. And for the first time in a long while, they're allowing themselves to sit with that feeling, not running from it, not explaining it away, not looking for someone else to blame, just sitting with it. And in that stillness, a different realization begins to emerge. A realization that's slowly encouraging them to see this entire story through a completely different set of eyes than before. A small light is still glowing while the rest of the world seems to be asleep. And there are certain thoughts that arrive out of nowhere. They don't knock. They don't ask for permission. They simply appear in those quiet moments when a person is no longer busy enough to keep running from themselves. I feel like this person is entering a season like that. A season where the silence has started to become louder than all the noise around them. Things that were pushed deep beneath the surface are slowly making their way back up. Old conversations, certain looks, moments the two of you once shared, things that seemed completely ordinary at the time. But now, looking back, they realize those moments were never as ordinary as they thought. And honestly, I don't think the most uncomfortable part for them is remembering Leo. The uncomfortable part is that they're beginning to see everything through Leo's eyes. That's a very different experience. Because for so long, they viewed this story through their own reasoning, through their own fears, through the pressures they were carrying. But as those walls begin to soften, a different question starts to emerge. How did Leo feel through all of this? What was it like constantly receiving mixed signals? What went through Leo's mind every time they suddenly pulled away? How much did Leo have to carry while trying to understand someone who refused to fully open up? And that's where the awakening really begins. Not when someone realizes they're hurting, but when they begin to understand how their actions may have hurt someone else. Wow. There's a deep sense of regret forming here. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that explodes emotionally and disappears the next day. This feels more like a slow-moving wave. Each day it grows a little stronger. Each day it reveals something they hadn't noticed before. There are moments when they replay an old conversation and suddenly understand what Leo was trying to say. There are memories that once made them feel justified, but now those same memories feel completely different. It's almost like rewatching a familiar movie years later. The movie hasn't changed, but the person watching it has. And when we change, the meaning of everything changes with us. I also feel like this person has been dealing with a lot of restless nights, not necessarily because they're waiting for something, but because their mind is no longer allowing them to ignore what they already know deep down. Some emotions become stronger the more they're suppressed. Some questions return the harder we try to avoid them. And honestly, I feel like they're caught somewhere in the middle of that cycle, a cycle of reflection, a cycle of memories, a cycle of words that probably should have been spoken a long time ago. What's interesting is that they once believed strength meant controlling their emotions. Now they're starting to realize that real strength may come from facing those emotions, without running, without denying them, without continuing to blame circumstances, just looking directly at them. Looking directly at the choices they made, the opportunities they let pass by, the moments they wish they had handled differently. And Leo, your presence appears all throughout this journey of self-reflection, not like a memory that's fading away, but more like a mirror reflecting everything they've spent so much time trying to avoid within themselves. The more they think, the more they reflect, the harder certain truths become to deny. There were things they used to justify, things they always had an explanation for, but those explanations don't seem as convincing anymore. There were stories they told themselves over and over again, yet now, even they are beginning to stop believing those stories. I feel like this is the moment when the fog is finally starting to lift. Little by little, slowly, without force, without urgency, but enough for them to begin seeing what truly matters. And because of that shift in perspective, they're being led toward an even deeper realization about the place Leo has held in their life all along. A smile appears for a brief moment and then quietly fades away. Not because something sad happened, but because sometimes a beautiful memory can remind us just how much we miss someone. And honestly, I feel like this person is beginning to think about Leo in a very different way now. It's no longer about who's right or who's wrong. It's no longer about who should reach out first. It's no longer about the arguments they once used to protect themselves. What remains now feels much simpler, much more honest. They miss the feeling of being themselves when they were around Leo. They miss those conversations where time seemed to move faster than usual. They miss feeling understood without having to explain every part of themselves. And that's leading them toward an important realization. Not everyone who enters our lives leaves the same kind of impact. Some people come and go without changing much at all, but others quietly transform the way we see ourselves. And Leo, I feel like that's the kind of energy we're talking about here. This person has been looking back on the connection the two of you shared, and they're starting to realize just how many things they unintentionally took for granted. Because when something beautiful remains in our lives for a long time, we sometimes forget how valuable it really is. We assume it will always be there. We assume we'll always have more time. We assume we can come back to it whenever we're ready, until one day there's an empty space, and that empty space begins to reveal what used to fill it. I feel like this person once saw Leo as a natural part of their life, almost like a constant, something they never really questioned. But now they're beginning to see Leo more like a gift they never fully understood the value of. And what's surprising them most is what's happening within themselves. There are qualities they always appreciated about who they were: their confidence, their passion, their belief in better things ahead, their willingness to stay open to life. And as they reflect, they're realizing that many of those qualities felt stronger when Leo was around. Not because Leo changed them, but because Leo brought out parts of them that had always been there. Wow, that's interesting. It's almost like someone carrying a lantern into a dark room. The lantern doesn't create the room. It simply helps you see what was already there. And I feel like that's exactly what this person is beginning to understand. For a long time, they thought they were drawn to specific things: physical attraction, chemistry, fun memories, moments of excitement. But the deeper they reflect, the more they realize that's not what kept Leo in their heart. What stayed with them was something much deeper. It was the way Leo inspired them to become a better version of themselves. It was the feeling of being encouraged. The feeling that someone could see potential inside them, even when they couldn't see it themselves. And I think they're finally starting to understand why, after everything that's happened, they still haven't truly forgotten Leo. Because the memory of Leo isn't connected only to a person, it's connected to a version of themselves. A version that felt more open, more genuine, more hopeful, a version they miss very deeply. There are days when they think they've moved on. Days when they convince themselves they've left it all behind. But then something small appears, a song, a phrase, a photograph, and suddenly all those feelings return. Not in the painful way they once did, but in a way that makes them stop and wonder, out of everyone I've met, why does this person still hold such a special place in my heart? And I feel like the answer is beginning to reveal itself, not through a dramatic moment, not through a life-changing event, but through quiet realizations, the kind that arrive when the heart finally stops resisting, when pride is no longer the loudest voice in the room. And when that happens, this person begins to see the meaning of this connection in a way that's far deeper than anything they understood before. A perspective that gently reminds them that some truths become too important to keep locked away forever. An unsent message, a conversation written out and then deleted. An explanation that has crossed their mind countless times, yet somehow never found its way into words. And honestly, I feel like this person is standing in a very unusual space right now. It's that place where someone is no longer trying to convince themselves that everything is fine. But they also haven't fully figured out what to do with everything they're feeling. There are so many thoughts moving through them, and they're no longer asking questions like who was right or who was wrong. The questions feel much deeper now. If I could go back to that moment, would I say something different? If I had been more honest, would things have unfolded differently? If I hadn't let fear make so many decisions for me, would I still have something precious that I no longer have now? I keep feeling like they're beginning to notice gaps in the story they never acknowledged before. There were truths they knew, but never had the courage to speak out loud. There were emotions they felt, but always pushed aside. There were fears influencing their actions far more than they ever admitted. And what's occupying their mind the most right now isn't how to explain themselves. It's whether Leo ever misunderstood what was really happening inside them. Because the more they look back, the more they realize how much Leo never got to hear. Leo saw the silence, but not the internal battle behind that silence. Leo saw the distance, but not the fears that created it. Leo saw them pull away, but not the pressure they were carrying beneath a calm exterior. And I don't feel like this person is trying to justify what happened. Honestly, I feel the opposite. I feel someone who's beginning to take responsibility for their part in the story. And that's why this energy feels so much more mature than before. Because there's a huge difference between explaining something and blaming something. A huge difference between honesty and searching for excuses in hopes of being forgiven. I feel like they're learning that difference now. Some apologies come from the fear of losing someone, but other apologies come from finally understanding the pain you've caused. And the energy I'm picking up feels much closer to the second one. It's not dramatic. It's not loud. It's simply becoming clearer. A realization that there were things they could have handled better. Moments where they could have been more open. Times when they could have chosen honesty instead of self-protection. I also feel like they're starting to imagine a conversation. Not an argument, not a confrontation, just a conversation. One where they can finally say the things they've never said before. The things they've held on to for far too long. The feelings they've kept hidden for far too long. The words that never had the chance to leave their heart. And what's interesting is that the more they think about that conversation, the more they realize it isn't only about speaking the truth. It's also about accepting the truth. Accepting that they were afraid. Accepting that they made mistakes. Accepting that some wounds can't be erased with a few explanations. Wow! That's a difficult realization for anyone. But I feel like it's softening something inside them. Making them less defensive. Less stubborn, less controlled by pride. And Leo, I honestly feel like their heart is beginning to move ahead of their logic, not in a reckless way, not in an impulsive way, but in the way someone finally stops running from what they truly feel. Maybe they still don't know exactly what they would say. Maybe they still don't know where they would begin. Maybe there's still a lot of anxiety around whether those words would even be welcomed, but with each passing day, they seem to understand something more clearly. Some feelings can't stay buried forever. Some stories eventually need to be spoken. Some truths eventually need to be faced. And in the privacy of their own silence, this person seems to be preparing themselves for what may be the most important question of all. Because if their heart can see it this clearly now, how much longer can they keep pretending they never felt it in the first place? A certain name keeps finding its way into their thoughts more often than usual. Not because they're trying to think about it, but because sometimes the harder we try to forget someone, the more clearly they remain in our memories. And honestly, I feel like this is where the story begins to shift. This is no longer the stage where they're simply sitting with their thoughts. It's no longer just about focusing on what was lost. Something inside them is starting to move, very slowly, very gently. But enough for them to realize they don't want to keep living inside a distance they helped create. What's interesting is that this energy doesn't feel rushed at all. It doesn't feel like someone suddenly being swept away by emotion. It feels more like someone who spent a long time reflecting and is finally beginning to understand what they truly want. Because I do feel that they miss Leo, probably more than they've allowed themselves to admit. And it's not just the beautiful moments they miss, not just the happy memories. It's the entire feeling of having Leo in their life. You know, some people enter our lives and leave us with a few memories, but others become part of the way we experience the world itself. And I feel like Leo carried that kind of presence. This person is starting to realize that life continues moving forward. The world keeps turning, responsibilities remain, days keep passing, but there are certain spaces that time alone doesn't easily fill. Certain connections leave a deeper imprint than we fully understand while we're living inside them. I also feel like they've been looking at themselves very closely lately, not with blame, not with self-punishment, but with a greater sense of maturity. They're beginning to ask themselves difficult questions. Which version of me created that distance? Which version of me chose protection over openness? Which version of me allowed fear to speak louder than my heart? And the more they sit with those questions, the more they realize they don't want to keep being that version of themselves. Wow, that's actually one of the strongest things I'm picking up here, because this desire to change doesn't feel like it's coming from pressure. It doesn't feel like they're trying to prove something. It feels like they're beginning to see the person they genuinely want to become, someone more honest, someone more courageous, someone who can express what they're feeling instead of hiding behind silence. And honestly, there's a softness in their energy now that wasn't there before, a gentleness, a willingness to feel. Very different from the periods when everything was covered by defenses and emotional walls. It's almost like they're finally allowing themselves to experience emotions they've been trying to control for a very long time. And from that place, Leo no longer appears as a painful lesson. Leo no longer appears as a memory that only brings sadness. Instead, Leo feels more like a light helping them understand what truly matters. Now, that doesn't mean everything suddenly becomes easy. I don't feel that at all. In fact, I still sense a lot of uncertainty here. There are still questions without answers. There are still distances that haven't been crossed. There are still things left unsaid. But the difference is this: they're no longer turning away from those feelings. They're no longer pretending they don't care. They're no longer trying to convince themselves that everything belongs entirely in the past. Because the more they grow through this experience, the more they understand that some connections don't disappear simply because we decide to stop thinking about them. And some people continue to hold a special place in our hearts long after time has passed. And Leo, I feel like that realization is softening so many of the walls that once existed, opening the door to new thoughts, new emotions, new ways of understanding this story. It's almost as if they're standing in front of a doorway they never had the courage to walk through before. Not because they suddenly have all the answers, not because everything is completely clear, but because for the first time in a very long time, they're beginning to feel ready to be honest with their own heart in a way they never were before. Leo, whatever this story may be reflecting in your life right now, I hope it has given you something meaningful to sit with. Because sometimes the biggest changes don't begin with what's happening around us. They begin in the moment someone finally becomes honest with their own heart. So take what resonates with you and gently let the rest drift away. Thank you for spending this time here with me. Honestly, each and every one of you is such a special part of this community, and I truly appreciate that more than you know. If this message connected with you in any way, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I always enjoy reading your stories, your experiences, and the perspectives you bring. And before we go, I just want to remind you to be gentle with yourself. Growth doesn't always happen in loud, dramatic moments. Sometimes it happens quietly, one realization at a time, one honest conversation with yourself at a time. So, wherever you are on your journey, I hope you continue moving forward in a way that feels right for you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your energy with me. And I'll see you again in the next reading. Until then, take care, Leo. Bye for now.